This is Synopsis, a series of conversations in the framework of Abeceda Institute. My name is Neža Zupanc, and today with me is Miles Friday. Miles, welcome, and thank you for taking your time. I will ask you to start with a brief introduction of yourself.
Sure, yeah. Thanks for having me here, and it's a pleasure to talk. So I'm Miles Friday. I'm currently living in San Antonio, Texas, where I teach at the University of Texas at San Antonio. I myself am a composer, and I also do a lot of work with sound art and installation art. And more recently, I've been performing a lot as well with DIY electronics, as well as various computer music setups and things like that.
Uh, DIY electronics, if I remember correct, were already a part of a composition that you submitted to a Bethesda ensemble. That was already years ago, if I remember correctly, right?
Yeah, it was a few years ago. So as I remember it, the piece I did was a work with audio feedback and a series of contact microphones on
Yes.
loudspeakers, causing various forms of physical movement and bouncing between those
Yes.
contact microphones
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
loudspeakers.
Yeah.
And I believe at that time, I was trying to incorporate a lot of that work into my compositions and doing this kind of hands-on practice at home, but being isolated in the home studio and then giving that to performers in the form of pieces and so on. And I
Right.
kind of have traveled to the point where I'm thinking about bringing these myself to some sort of performance context, and then working with it that way.
So that was when you were starting to incorporate this into your practice, or or
Yeah,
or
and
not?
for my own performance and
Mhm,
stuff.
mhm,
I mean,
mhm.
there was going back a little bit when I studied composition in college, I always thought it was very funny that growing up, I played
Yeah.
music all the time, studying piano and a whole bunch of different instruments. Decided I wanted to do composition. I went to conservatory and started studying composition. And it was at that time I played probably the least amount of music I've ever played in my life because you're writing music for others to perform.
Yeah.
So part of my journey and I guess reclaiming a hands-on practice for myself involves working with electronics and especially those DIY hands-on um, possibilities there, which then leads me back to performing myself again and so on, and still composing for others as well. But it's kind of a maybe a full circle moment in that sense.
Yeah, I see. So you started on the instruments. Which instruments next to piano?
Yeah. So in a fairly traditional background, my first instrument was piano. I think my mom first started teaching me it when I was like 5 years old, quite young.
She's a
Uh,
musician as well.
yeah. So a lot of different members of my family are musicians, singing in choirs and things like that. But you know, when you're a little kid, you don't want your mom teaching you things. So we quickly moved on to the neighborhood piano teacher. And she taught kind of standard classical music, but did one thing that was really important is that she assigned what she called one-liners, where every single week you had to write one line of music. And then you would start the lesson by bringing that line in, and you would improv together on that line and talk about what you've written and what you could kind of do to improv. Um, and I think the method there was people practicing piano, learning classical music, practicing their scales, arpeggios. You come into your lesson and you're kind of nervous to perform that in a sense for your teacher. So it's sort of an icebreaker in a way to loosen up the music making environment. But for me, I thought, hey, this is really cool. I want to just do the one-liners every week and do a lot of that type of work. So I started composing from an early age from that. And then I stemmed out to trying to get my hands on as many different instruments as I could. So I took guitar lessons, bass guitar lessons, played in bands, sang in choir. I played cello in orchestra for a while.
Hmm.
Um, but piano was kind of the core of that growing up. And then I went to conservatory and took my first electronic music class, and everything changed from that point onward.
I see. Because today, what I do notice in your opus is there's a lot of electronics. Where did that step happen? When did you decide to do more of that, and perhaps for what reason, or what did you see in it? What do you still find in that working with those mediums?
Sure. So I think originally, when I went to undergrad, I had been composing for a while, and it was a bit of a artistically frustrating time for me where I felt like I wasn't trying anything new musically. I was kind of writing the same piece over and over again, just staring at Sibelius and the bright screen, entering notes. And then when I took that electronic music class, it felt like there was this whole new world where I could continue my exploration and journey of learning new things with and around sound. Um, and then after that undergrad degree, I started at the Eastman School of Music, and I was lucky enough to get a TA-ship in what was then called the Eastman Audio Research Studios, which stands for EARS. Um, and that was with Oliver Schneller, who was there at the time. And I believe he's now based in Germany. And that was a really um, artistically and sound expanding experience for me. Um, to not only know there is this avenue of artistic creation, but to really be pushed and told, yeah, that's a good direction to explore further in. And I believe the first piece I wrote in that context was for a class concert we had there, where it was a 8-channel surround sound piece. But then I called it for prepared loudspeakers. So I got a bunch of cardboard tubes, metal sheets, and other things to place at and around the loudspeakers so they would vibrate and resonate accordingly. And then that kind of created this template for, yes, working with computer music and these kind of like high-tech digital-based settings, but then incorporating a more DIY hands-on environment with that and kind of bridging those two together. And then in my doctoral degree, I started working more with sound art and installation art. So oftentimes I think of my work as a kind of triangulation between these three areas of composing, installation art, and sound art, and then computer music.
What would you say are, as you see them, distinctions between sound art, composing, and digital art?
Sure, sure. So
Because
on
we
one
use
hand,
this term, you use these terms.
mhm.
These terms are used on regular basis today in composition, and sometimes it's assumed, I think, what is meant by
Yeah,
that.
of course.
Plus,
Yeah.
for anyone that perhaps hears it first time, also.
Sure, yeah. I think for me, it's useful to think about in, let's say it's like three different genres in some sense, and you can look at the structures and forms that constitute that genre. So on an architectural level, you can think of like composition or acoustic composition, music that's presented on a stage with a seated audience. There's a clear beginning and end, well-defined structure. Something like sound art, at least I envision oftentimes being in an art gallery setting, there may not be that clear teleological journey, from the start to the end, and we're headed in that direction. But it might be something that just exists in that space, and then people can walk around and move freely throughout that space. So I've done like a fun experiment is take that start to end format of a piece, play the start from one loudspeaker in an art gallery, the middle in another location, the end in another location. So then time actually becomes like a physical parameter in space that you can walk and explore different moments in a piece. Um, I think computer music, oftentimes that acousmatic format, but it's still in a seated crowd. Um, and then like an 8-channel surround sound uh, loudspeaker setup. So I feel like there's some physical distinctions, architectural distinctions, sound-based distinctions. But then when I'm actually creating, I like to kind of question and think about these parameters, but then simultaneously not worry too much about it. Not say, oh no, am I writing a concert music piece or am I making sound art? But for me, the fun is just kind of that free interplay and seeing maybe what new things are revealed when you bring one area to the other and vice versa.
Mm. And perhaps an example of that interplay of a composition where you would say you can point this out.
Sure, yeah. So I think in pretty much all of my compositions in the recent years, I've been trying to explore that in some way. Um, so I'll go to the most recent one. I just had a piece performed that I called Sonic Inflatables, and it was performed by Line Upon Line percussion trio, which is based in Austin, Texas. And we had them down here in San Antonio for a residency. And in that piece, I had two large loudspeakers, like PA system loudspeakers, lying flat on their backs. And both of them have this bass port, which when you play low frequencies out of it, like 30 hertz and below, it really physically pushes air to change pressure in the air, which then, creates sound. Um, so we had extremely high decibel, low frequency sound. And then I made a series of inflatables uh, that the ensemble members had to hold over the loudspeakers and wrap them in a very particular way, such that when the low frequency sound creates changes in the air pressure, it inflates the inflatable objects. So in that sense, I'm not quite sure what it is, if it's a concert piece, if it is visual art that's being made. If it's like, I was thinking in some sense, the loudspeakers are a visual synthesizer type thing, as the inflatables move, if it's kind of performance art. But whatever it is, it's sound, it's visuals, and it's definitely a performance-based practice with that.
How do you think or consider the actual final sound result, the music?
In that
For
piece?
example, yes,
Okay.
yes.
Yeah, so in that piece, I so using loudspeakers as an inflatable pump, it's kind of hard, they're not necessarily made to inflate objects or like inner tubes or things like that. And with the acoustic characteristics of those loudspeakers, different frequencies are meant to come out of that bass port, while other ones are meant to resonate through the mid-range loudspeaker membrane as well as the tweeter up on top.
Yeah.
So the frequencies were determined by what inflated the best. And I found different methods of holding the inflatable bags as well as different amplitudes and so on changed. And so the frequencies and waveforms, I was just going by what worked to inflate the best. And I found a few different options, which I then paired with different inflatables, because some of them were different colors. Like I had shiny, reflective ones, which were actually like emergency sleeping bags, those emergency like blankets.
No. Oh, the
If
shiny
you're
ones, the
camping out
silver
in
ones.
yeah. So I had some of those. I had these really large, curvy, spinny ones that were kind of a light pink, that I created myself by, they're actually picnic table cloths, and you iron them and melt them together and then cut out the different forms. Um, and then so a series of those. So I paired different waveforms and frequencies with different inflatable objects, and then would slowly just crossfade those different sounds as the performers grabbed a new inflatable and then began to inflate it and so on. And then all the performers also have to wear safety ear protection and stuff because it's quite loud, to really physically vibrate the air. And they're directly over the loudspeaker when they do that. And we passed out earplugs to all the audience members and so on too. So it's really not a great listening experience in that you can't really, it's not intended to hear like that. But with the earplugs, it's a physical embodied experience that you get, which is part of the intention there as well.
So is it also for the audience then, or was there an audience at any of the performances? Do you call it a
Really, luckily,
performance at
yes, we had
all?
an audience, so that was good. We tried to promote it. But yeah, there's audience there, of course. Yeah.
Yeah,
And
okay.
I'm happy to report we had a full house, so that was good.
It was more meant, don't get me wrong, it was more meant as, because you said it was not intended for listening, but just
no,
for the performer, for the performance, right?
yeah. I can reword that or be more specific in that, um, the listening experience of the piece is inherently a very physical one, where you're feeling the physical vibrations hit you and so on. So as they're inflating the inflatables, it's also pushing against your body as well. So it's really sound as a physical embodied phenomenon
Right.
and not necessarily just, a sonic quality in the air. And in fact, that's why we passed out the ear protection and stuff to everyone, because it's not necessarily intended to just be listened to in that kind of traditional mode of listening. And in
Right.
fact, if you do, it may damage your ears.
Ah, I
So,
see. It's curious. Seems like you really brought out the extreme of that of that thought of how physical the experience of sound and of music actually is.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, so that was my first piece. I've been experimenting with loudspeakers as pumps for various inflatable objects.
Mhm.
Um, And so that was my first time really putting it into a piece. So I'm really looking forward to exploring more
Right.
with that, seeing where it can take me.
What do you how do how is the response to that, or also how for you do you how do you look at this from a I don't know different perspective, maybe more uh, because I saw that first of all you're theorizing your work via your thesis, you're writing a lot as I noticed. Um, what are your findings with this kind of works? Is there something interesting that you would share you learned via this uh, very different to at least standard historic uh, music compositions? W- what do you
Sure,
see on the
yeah.
way while composing this, while seeing these pieces being performed?
Yeah, I think it's little bit difficult to answer in that I think I take my discovery process by composing, where I know some people in their artistic workflow, you come up with a concept, you theorize it, and then you realize the piece.
Mm-hmm.
I think oftentimes it's like you're existing in this confusing environment where there's all this information swirling. So then you write a piece because something's telling you, yeah, I would like to explore this. And then it's like a year later where you can reflect and then like write and figure out what the piece was about. I can say that in this piece specifically, line upon line percussion, which I want to go on record in thanking them for, being willing, one, not only willing to perform the piece, but also being really great at doing it and a great ensemble for realizing it. But they were telling me they were speaking to some people and trying to explain what the performance was. They're like, well, it's like a visual art thing, but it's also sound, but then it's kind of performance art and so on. So I think for me, it's in that sense, the process of discovering these kind of in-between areas between genres and presentation methods, which I think have really exciting results. For sound, I like to think about sound, yeah, as a physical phenomenon, but then how do we as humans and bodies interpret and experience that sound? And that's not necessarily only limited to our ears,
Yes.
uh, as a very physical thing, or with the inflatables. That's why I was saying a visual synthesizer. It's you can see sound or the result of sound in that sense. Um, and then also. Yeah, I had a third point, but now it's escaped
Mhm.
my mind, so I'll leave it at that. If it
Um,
returns, I
yeah,
can
yeah. No, if you remember it, please go ahead. But until then, uh, let's continue to also your thesis and your yeah, further to your theoretical work. Could you present that shortly, or share what is the main subject of your work there?
Sure. So if you're referring to the dissertation work I did at Cornell, there's two main components of it. One is a composition and portfolio of works, and then related to that is a more formal, prose-based work, basically a monograph on a particular subject. Um, so I chose the composer Marianne Amiche, who was the main artist and sound artist that I studied. And lots of her work deals with otoacoustic emissions, physical embodiment of sound, right, at high decibels and amplitudes. Um, and I also included conversations around other composers such as Yannis Xenakis with his Polytope multimedia series of works, as well as composers like Alvin Lucier and others like that as well. So it was largely a analysis of, I think, as like the instrumentalization of the loudspeaker, the physical environment that we're in, as well as the ear, and how can we use those for performance-based, sound-based purposes. And then related to that were my compositions, where I had a
Yes.
portfolio
Yes.
that I kind of directly related to those subjects. So one working with loudspeakers, one working with our ears, and then working with space and so on.
Right. And when you generally when you compose in your compositional practice, could you say what are the, apart from what you already pointed out, main categories you're working with, or what for you as a composer is important to have there present in the process of composition, in the finalization, in the performance? What do you work with there?
Sure. So I think for myself personally, and I'll apologize because maybe this is kind of a non-answer, but right now, and this is what has been true for the past maybe 7 years, with each piece, I want to try something new with it and feel like I'm continuing this journey of discovery. So that may be something very different at each point along the line. I was just messaging an old friend I went to undergrad with, and he wrote, I still remember the Miles that used to compose for instruments and scores. And then in my mind, I like laughed a little bit, but then I was also like, well, I still compose for instruments and scores. And I was like, well, no, actually, I haven't been that much. But if there was something that furthered that journey of discovery or things that I'm kind of investigating, um, then I would, pull out the five-line staff or something like that.
Right.
But I have been thinking of music in this kind of, maybe I shouldn't say music, but we're kind of in a post-music environment or world, or something that to me, feels the most comfortable to navigate in, which means like the process of instruments, how they get codified into their physical forms, how that's reflected in codified musical notation on the five-line staff, codified formats of performances and stuff to kind of pull those apart, and find new presentation methods and so on. And of course, there's a long history of that, especially with scores and like parametric notation, graphic notation, text scores, and then instruments, bending instruments, DIY techniques, and so on. But trying to kind of explore this. But then there is an aspect where oftentimes I call myself a composer, and I think that can confuse people sometimes. Um, because some people say, okay, no composition, I'm a sound artist or I'm a visual artist or this or that. But I feel like it is, in some capacity, the most true and honest presentation of myself, given my own background and context, as a musician, as a composer, writing scores and things like that. So most of the works I'm creating are in relation to notions of being a composer, of creating music in that kind of setting, historical context, cultural context, etc.
If you wouldn't have that background, what do you think would be most different? What does that give you?
It might give me like it might rid me of the guilt of having to make scores and like present that document there, you know?
Mhm.
Uh, but I would also lose a lot because I think I would lose the purpose of creating a lot of my works and like something only I suppose you could argue something only maintains or generates value when it's placed in relation to something else, you know? So if I'm working in relation to being a composer in that context, then to me that gives my work value. It makes me excited about what I'm doing, and
Yeah.
it makes me feel like I'm really working through these different materials and subjects. So I think I would lose that. I would maybe gain a loss of that worry because there's also a lot of worries involved with that as well. But I'm sure whatever other environment that I would be in, there it would be associated with whatever other worries of that environment as well. So.
Two questions. Back to the, let's say, how would you call this deviation from the standard notation?
Mhm.
Um, is there a certain lineage you orientate according to of composers that already were innovating in that area? And secondly, what post music era? Can you speak to that as well? With
I
your
can
work.
try, yeah. Some of these things are difficult to answer because when they're what I'm currently thinking about, I don't have the answers yet, but
Yeah,
it's the
yeah,
point that
yeah.
I'm trying to
I
explore.
see. All right.
But yeah, for notation, I think well, I have this story I always tell where when I was younger, I really wanted to start to try to push the boundaries in terms of what I knew and what I was comfortable with. So what that meant was maybe I want to explore microtones and composing that way. And I had a teacher who told me, let's not use microtones there. And I think that it was good advice because it was um, aimed at rehearsal efficiency and like large ensemble contexts and things like that. But then I took it very personally. I was not happy with that because I felt like I wasn't allowed to explore and experiment and work with these things. Um, so then a little bit later, I wanted to kind of pull apart the score a little bit or be able to compose things that maybe didn't fit as nicely into that 5-line staff or even a metric context. Um, and so there's many different sort of avenues I experimented and tried with. Some things, for example, uh, curvy lines, you know? I don't always like conceptualize pitch as discrete points, whether that's 12 pitches or different divisions of the octave or microtonal formations. I think of it as curves and gestures. So I thought, well, why don't I compose that way, right? Just get rid of the translation process of translating a gesture into a series of discrete values didn't seem right. So I thought, okay, I'll compose with fluid lines and things like that, which then transferred my composing space from something like Sibelius to something like Illustrator or graphic design program. And then in that software space, it enabled me to start thinking about rhythm a little differently. Um,
In what way?
So I'm thinking of one piece in particular where I was like, okay, let me just try it. So I had all these like quarter note equals 2, quarter note equals 3. So really slow tempos. And I
Oh.
was thinking of, I've been feeling beats as large breaths or kind of phrases and things like that.
Mm.
Um, and then I thought, well, why doesn't my score communicate the way that I'm thinking about this music? And you can't. Previously, I had done the thing where you do a little bracket and you say, okay, 30 seconds bracket there. But then
Yes.
that automatically contains the context of counting seconds. And I thought, okay, so it's kind of self-defeating there, and it's not actually how I'm thinking about it. And I thought, what if it's like a large gesture or beat that you can fill in there? So things like that, or creating. relational context between performers via text-based instruction. So for example, I don't know, like if it, I'm just going to make something up, it won't be very
Yeah,
good. But
please.
if it was like, okay, you clap every time I snap, every time you clap, I do like a multi snap, right?
Yeah.
So we're sitting there, we're listening to each other. And then when I hear that, I respond to it. And that'll create something outside of a metric grid necessarily. And you can kind of set up these networks between performers, put a feedback loop in there somewhere, and then it's a self-generating relational context between performers. So that you can't really notate in Sibelius, but it's something you can create a score for, which has a totally different metric context, totally different pitch-based context, and so on. I don't even know if I answered your question, but I started thinking about notation and things like that. So
Yeah, yeah.
something along those
Uh,
lines. Yeah.
You did in your way. What was also what I was also curious of if there's a specific figure that you orientate, or if there
Hmm.
are certain uh, past innovations that made an impact on how you develop the notation system for your compositions as well.
Yeah, so a lot of people, I have to preface it with, I'm always hesitant to say, yes, this is my singular
Of
figure I'm
course, yes,
emulating or
yes.
something like that. Um, and that's a bit of a uncomfortability of association, not knowing people, not knowing who they actually are or their works or some context like that. But there's definitely a lot of people I've taken as examples and inspirations and drawn from or seen and used to clarify a context where maybe I would not like to do that. Um, so some examples, like way back when I was a younger student, a composer like Aaron Cassidy and looking at his scores was fascinating to me to see like a violin piece written out on multiple staves there and partitions between, oh, the left hand playing a certain type of material, the right hand playing something unrelated. Um, and I thought, wow, that is a accurate conceptualization of how I, one, play these instruments when I'm holding them, but also how I think about them in those activities. Now, maybe the sonic result between some of my approaches using that notational system is quite different, but just that kind of representation of it. And then things like Yoko Ono, Grapefruit, and like text-based scores, which are more prompts. Um, and some of them are like, I'm not sure if they're actually intended to be realized, but intended to be reflected on and thought about and so on. So for text-based contexts. Um, Someone like Xenakis, who I mentioned already, a piece like Metastasis inspired by the curvature of the Phillips Pavilion and so on. So you can see the physical building, you can see the architectural sketches, you can see the graphed mathematical formalizations of those kind of contours. And then you can see that translation into all the string glissandos and things like that. So for me, it's like, I love the relation between those different areas. One, how they also just visually look. And then thinking they're all kind of scores, but intended for slightly different contexts and different people to realize, whether it's an architectural blueprint or a score for performers to then realize. But what if some of those wires get crossed and mismatched and so on? Um, yeah, so a lot of different things and composers along those lines. But I find looking at scores fascinating. And I also love writing scores that aren't intended for any performance, but might be like a book on your coffee table or something like that. So I have like a collection of scores called Getting to Know Your Loudspeakers, which are just scores for your loudspeakers and prompts for interacting with them. And I'm not so convinced it'd be a good idea to perform them. It could be, I don't know. But it's something to look at and read through and to think about as you do it. So one of the pieces is called How to Annoy Your Loudspeakers, and it's a score of just plugging in your loudspeakers. So yeah, it's a lot of things like that as well.
But be careful with the ears, huh?
Yeah, yeah,
Depends
yeah.
which cables and which
Exactly. Right.
speakers.
Yeah, yeah.
Anyone who's listening? Curious. So, yeah, that's a new one. And since now you've really developed this answer, maybe still in terms of uh, the system of notation as you use it now, or as it differs with perhaps each composition depending on what you are actually trying to do there. Uh, does anything else that you want to note there? What does does it seem like you have made a sort of a notation system of your own? What are the specific things that you perhaps found in this process of devising it, and why not just five lines? Why not just the step? We are past that point. I realize, but just to perhaps sum it
Yeah.
up. Sum it up.
It depends on the context of the piece a lot. Why not? Um, I don't want to say I would never use a five-line staff. In fact, I'm making parts for a sinfonietta right now, so I've just been staring at a five-line staff for hours and hours, formatting it. So I'd be a hypocrite if I said I've completely left the five-line staff. But I think when I think of notation, um, I think of the what I'm trying to achieve musically and how that is best communicated to a performer. If the goal is notating for a performer, I also think of notation as a artistic context or some sort of discursive object to just generate a thought or a dialogue, in which case I will notate very differently, like in that coffee table book that's just meant to
Right,
be read, right?
right, right.
Um, so if it's for a performer, if it is a pitch-based thing, if those pitches fall in a metric grid, then the five-line staff is a great tool to best communicate that. I think that tool also is accompanied by its own like historically contingent context. So you're kind of associating yourself with that. That's a whole nother question if you're comfortable with that or not. So there's that. But other performance contexts, for example, I have this piece called Sonic Operator, which is a series of performers that um, there's loudspeakers around the ground in the performance space and microphones, and they generate audio feedback between the two. And the performers take a series of resonators, which are like large PVC pipes, small glass objects, usually vases and stuff, and hold them over the loudspeakers so they resonate at different frequencies. The first time I had the piece performed, I was like, I'm not sure if creating a score is really effective here.
Right.
Because you can try to word something and it really doesn't make sense to try to explain like that type of movement with your hand. How do you, right? It's best just to show someone. So the score was just a verbal communication. I was there in person, and so we got to workshop it
Right,
and
right,
step through
right.
what that was. I had the piece performed again, and after that first performance, we recorded it and I videos some photos of it. So my score was actually a series of GIFs that I made.
Mm.
Uh, so for example, if it's that, you could just see someone doing that type of action. And
Mhm.
then, okay, step one, you do this type of action with this relationship to the loudspeaker or the microphone. And then so it's the series of steps you go through there. And I thought that worked pretty well. Now, the downside is you have to have a first performance to be able to make the score or
Right.
something like that. But in that case, it was just me thinking of what is the best way to communicate this idea and also document it. So maybe if someone just wants to check out the piece or think about it, they can kind of see that as almost a report on the performance or something like that.
Do you ever think about historical practice also including what was never at that time called a score, but also there was the oral tradition and the verbal communication with the. Do you ever consider this, especially when mentioning, you know, do you want to associate yourself with the historic way of making a score, for example? Do you ever consider this? Because it does, when thinking of what is usually considered a score, something with a staff and notes on it, it is completely in a different area. But when you think, there was always also oral communication and verbal communication, oral tradition. Do you think about this? How do you
Yeah,
consider this,
definitely.
especially with the, yeah?
I think it's such an important part of music making, and all the kind of like tacit or in regards to a score, unsaid
Yes,
things that go into creating a
exactly.
piece, putting music together, also composing and writing and stuff like that. Um, I feel like there's this funny notion, and also I think this stems from historical contexts, at least in like Western classical music, and the concept of like the work that a composer creates, which is like a well-written score is a historical document that's preserved, predicated on all these different things. And then there's this kind of this like grand posturing of composers that's like, I created my work, it's like in history, I'm part of a lineage or something like that, you know? Um, and part of that also is this notion that if you create a really efficient, well-formed score, it can be performed a lot of times. It's easy to shop around, give to different performers and so on. But I also felt, in my experience as a composer, and maybe I shouldn't say this too loudly, but lots of times you only get one performance of a piece. So I thought, why am I putting all this effort into making a score in this format? Only going to be performed once anyways, so I should use that opportunity to do like what I really want to do with the piece, you know? And actually, the one-time performance, um, if it's also, it can be a one-time performance on purpose in like a site-specific thing or something that really can only be realized that one time. And I think that actually brings a lot of new value to a work. And you're really doing something with the people in your current collaborators or the people in that space that are there and creating something special that's here and now. And it can be really much more impactful for all the people that you're around,
Right.
and exist with at the same time. Um,
So
so there's kind of two sides.
reproduction of the score is not a priority anymore, not necessarily.
Not necessarily,
And
yeah. It,
as you
maybe it's
always, as you mentioned the whole time, you're kind of double questioning all of those as a predicate, right?
yeah. Yeah, yeah. So I'm not necessarily saying don't make a score. There's benefits such as giving that to performers to play with ease and using a standardized method. But if you open up that black box and look at the stuff inside of it and try something new, you can make something really special as well. So I think whatever you're doing, you should play to the benefits of that and not try to conform to one side because you feel this obligation or something and it's not really what you're after.
However, still, you also write quite lengthy scores, if I remember correct.
Yeah.
I sheltered myself the
Yeah.
DIY sound installation that I think
Yes.
Jan
Yeah.
Kopacz made at that time.
Yeah.
It was quite a lengthy text, if I
That is
recall,
true. Yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah.
So
Yeah.
easily
So that
reproducible.
is where the journey of, I'll say, discovering and exploring things through my pieces comes in.
Yes, yes.
Because that would be that type of thing I'm experimenting with and
Right, right.
learning. So it all depends on the context and the environment that it was made in. In that case too, if I remember correctly, I made that piece during lockdown, during COVID, which is all about you existing in a space, creating a sound sculpture. So it was me looking at the materials around me creating sound from them, and then documenting that through a score, which then can be used for a performance context, or can be read, and maybe I'll say morals can be extracted from that to then look at the objects around you and think, how can you interact with them in a sound-based way? And then I think the final page, I can't remember if it was that one or a different one I made at the same time, but it's something along the lines of invite your friends.
Right.
Which maybe at that point was wishful thinking, but then to bring other people into that process and build a community with what you've done.
Yeah, almost illegal sometimes at that time. So this conversation makes me consider how it happens more and more today, that it's less upfront on how to present, how to also or ask someone to present their opus, since, like on your case, you're constantly stressing. It's like, yes, it is this, but it's not just this. This is a part of it, but it's only in this way, in this relation to the other part, and that is so. Which brings me to a question. Today, you as a composer, how do you see presenting your work to and sharing your work with anyone? Does it matter that someone has some context, or how do you think about that? What is the way for you to go if you would? If someone can only, let's say, hear one composition of yours, and how do you think about this? As in your opus today, your overview of your work, do you consider that?
Yeah, definitely. I think it would depend on the context a lot. Once
Again,
again,
yeah,
a
yeah.
too long the answer, but I have a longer explanation. And to be fully honest, it's something I don't know if I'm struggling with or just trying to figure out. Because I was a student for such a long time, and I got my doctorate just over a year and a half ago. So, in some sense, up until that point, I was always kind of composing for my teacher or mentor, in the sense that you're writing a piece, their voice is like a hidden influence, and then you go to your lesson seeking feedback on what you're doing and kind of trying to work in relation to that. And now it's completely changed. I don't have a voice there, reminding me to do certain things or challenging me to rethink something I'm doing. So it's up to myself. Um, However, I think, well, it's not really up to myself. I'm creating these works to share with others and bring in for the most part, to share with others, and bring in like a community practice, just people coming to the concert, creating a dialogue with other composers and musicians and so on. So then I guess the works I've composed, I'm attempting to create them in relation to others around me and so on. So for example, the sonic inflatables piece with the loudspeakers at low frequencies with the inflatable bags and so on was presented here in San Antonio. And one of the things I've observed since moving to San Antonio is that there's not necessarily a lot of new music or experimental music, although there are some really great concert series and things like that. But San Antonio as a whole has a really strong support for visual art and contemporary art, with a lot of practicing artists and sound artists who are coming from a visual art side of things in gallery spaces and so on. So a lot of that piece was made thinking of new friends, collaborators, and colleagues who are coming from the visual art scene and being influenced by them, but also thinking of myself as a composer and saying, hey, check out this. I have a sound-based way where we can kind of think about some of these contexts and environments and so on.
Right.
Um, so that would be my long
Yeah,
answer.
yeah, perfect, perfect.
Yeah.
So another important question. What is the last composition that you wrote and does not include loudspeakers? I'm joking. What about the humor in your composition? Do you address that also? Because that's quite humorous to write a composition for a loudspeaker. How to annoy your loudspeaker.
Yeah.
Even if it's for a coffee table book, you know?
Yeah. I don't know. Maybe I have a that's a tough one. I don't think about humor a lot when I am composing. I feel very serious when I compose, and then when I hang out with friends, it's like the totally opposite. I'm not gonna be, come on, let's be casual and whatever. But maybe there's a bit of like I would like to think there's a little bit of like mischievous humor in there sometimes, in terms of annoying loudspeakers, or sometimes like in the sonic operator piece, some instructions on how you hold the tubes and pretend like they're very heavy, and like theatrical elements and things like that. But I wouldn't say they're necessarily like comedy-based pieces, because I think my goal would more be to create like a site for critical reflection. But maybe it takes humor to reflect on what it is asking of you. But I think that's
Right.
super common. Although it would be fun. Maybe I should explore it more.
Right. So critical reflection next to also the social aspect as you um, uh, described before.
Mhm.
Why is that important to you as a composer, as an artist? I know
Yeah, I
it sounds
mean,
obvious, but
yeah, no, I'm trying to think of like really why is that important, and it's hard to answer exactly beyond the feeling of there's an aspect of art making, which can be very therapeutic, in that it's the time you get to spend alone, the time you get to create and express. And then it's also that time or a tool that allows you to make a lot of friends and kinships and things like that. Um, but if my time alone, where I'm working on a project, is too repetitious, or it's always the same thing, um, it's quite sad. It's not something I enjoy. So it needs to be a journey, something that provokes thought. And then I feel like that kind of provides some degree of purpose of exploration, um, and thought behind sound and so on. And then I've seen how sound can um, open up avenues for critical thinking, but also what's involved with that is things like mutual support, self-actualization, all those sort of things. And so I feel like it can be a pathway towards that, which then in a society is very, very important and powerful. I wouldn't go so as far to say that I've achieved that, like that's a kind of too grand of a statement, but it's definitely on my mind and something that I attempt to work towards through my pieces, which then it's a great personal therapeutic type practice working with these materials, but something you can use to further what you're, providing in this world, I suppose.
yeah, yeah. Um, in the future, or what are you working for right now, and is there something that you see you really want to achieve in arts in the future?
Sure. On a very practical level, I have two upcoming residencies, one in Stockholm at the EMS, Electronic Music Studios there. And I'm working on an album project, which the draft title of it is Material Listening, which will be an album that is intended for listening to with household objects and things like that, so that whoever is listening becomes a type of performer or gets the agency to explore how they perceive sound and so on. So one example, well, I can't really do it because my cup here is filled with water, but audio that's specifically made with a whole bunch of different resonant frequencies. And if you hold the cups over your ears, you get that seashell effect, which will then bring out those different resonant frequencies. But it is very dense rhythmic audio. So when you hear it all at once, it sounds more like a wash, very noisy and so on. But if you isolate those various resonant frequencies, you suddenly get rhythmic activity. Because if it's all frequencies in this rhythmic activity, it kind of blurs together. If you isolate it, you can hear that individual rhythm. So different parts, kind of hidden materials within the sound. That's kind of the first draft of one of the tracks. I have to create the rest, but that's coming up, so I'm excited to work on that. And then I have another residency in Berlin, which is part of a partnership between San Antonio and Berlin and the Contemporary at Blue Star, which is a art gallery here in San Antonio. So I'll be in Berlin for 3 months working at a studio there. And one thing I'm really curious in and haven't explored too much yet is thermoacoustics in sound. So using heat, maybe flame-based heat, to create resonance and so on in various resonators. I don't know what that'll be or what it will look like, but I have imaginations and dreams and so on. So that's something I'm looking forward to next. We'll see if it works or not, though. I don't know.
Yeah, great. All right. So with this on the table, we will slowly conclude the conversation, and therefore I would like to ask you for two brief messages. One for anyone that is aspiring to start composing, and the other one for anyone of your future listeners.
Okay, what I would say to them?
Yes, brief message.
Yes, brief message to the aspiring composer. If you're anything like me, it's very scary and intimidating and what that future holds. So I guess the first thing I would like to acknowledge that and hold space for saying yes, it is scary and fearful, as a kind of life path and journey. But some things that have worked well for me are being very open to collaboration, inviting new practices into your compositional work, and working towards failure in some contexts, which means that you can then take the next composition and build off of that. And then the second one, future listeners, it's not always listening, it's everything else also. So sometimes just listening with some headphones may not be the right way to experience something. Sometimes seeing something is the right way to experience. Sometimes close your eyes and only listen, but be aware of the format that you're perceiving a piece in, and then think about how that influences what you are perceiving. And thank you for listening if you do.
Miles Friday, thank you for sharing.
Yeah, thank you so much.